If this video found you, it did not do so at the beginning of a change. It arrived after something already moved. That distinction matters. What you are experiencing now is not ignition, not activation, not the dramatic surge the mind expects when it imagines transformation. What you are in is stabilization. The shift has already occurred, and what follows is coherence settling into place. This is why there may be a strange calm underneath everything. A quiet neutrality. A sense that something is different without being able to point to a single external reason. The nervous system is no longer bracing. The inner environment is no longer negotiating. There is less friction between who you are and what you are perceiving. This does not feel like excitement. It feels like arrival. The mind often misinterprets this phase. It waits for fireworks. It searches for proof. It assumes that if nothing is urgently happening, nothing has happened at all. But reality does not reorganize itself through spectacle. It reorganizes itself through alignment. And alignment is silent. When resistance drops, there is no noise to announce it. You are not here because you are about to shift. You are here because awareness recognized itself after the shift. Recognition always comes second. Consciousness never celebrates the moment of movement. It notices the stillness that follows and understands, without language, that something has locked into place. This is why effort feels unnecessary right now. Why forcing thoughts, plans, or explanations feels slightly off. Stabilization does not ask for participation. It asks for allowance. The field is already responding. Identity is already adjusting. The body is already sinking to a different internal rhythm. Nothing needs to be pushed forward. Calm is not the absence of momentum. Calm is momentum without resistance. Neutrality is not emptiness. It is balance. Subtle clarity is not confusion. It is integration happening below the level of words. The absence of urgency is not stagnation. It is proof that you are no longer chasing the shift because you are no longer outside of it. This is the part few people recognize. They mistake peace for a pause. They mistake stability for delay. But consciousness does not rush when it has arrived. It settles. It roots. It allows reality to catch up to the internal decision that has already been made. Nothing about this moment requires excitement. Excitement belongs to seeking. This belongs to knowing. And knowing does not need to announce itself loudly. It simply becomes obvious when you stop trying to name it. Let this be simple. You did not find this message to be convinced. You found it because something in you already knows what phase you are in. The recognition you feel now is the mechanism itself. This is certainty without adrenaline. This is completion without drama. This is stabilization. If you are aligned with this frequency, subscribe and remain within it. A genuine shift does not arrive with noise. It does not crash into your life announcing itself with intensity or emotional spectacle. When movement is real, when coherence actually changes, the system quiets. This is not a paradox. It is a law. Turbulence belongs to resistance, not transformation. When resistance dissolves, the signal disappears, and what remains is stillness. Most expectations around change are inverted. The mind associates movement with sensation, emotion, reaction, and visible proof. But those are the symptoms of misalignment adjusting itself. They are not the markers of alignment itself. When the field reorganizes cleanly, there is no friction to generate drama. The result is calm. Silence. A reduction of internal commentary. A noticeable lack of emotional charge around things that once felt important. Stillness is often misunderstood as stagnation because it does not stimulate the identity that thrives on seeking. But stillness is not empty. It is precise. It is coherence without interference. When the inner state no longer contradicts itself, there is nothing to oscillate. The system stabilizes. The noise turns off because there is nothing left to negotiate. This is why neutrality shows up after real movement. Not numbness. Not dissociation. Neutrality as balance. The emotional guidance system has completed its instruction. Expansion and contraction are no longer needed because alignment has been reached. When you stop feeling pulled forward or pushed away, it is not because nothing is happening. It is because everything necessary has already happened internally. The expectation of external signs comes from the belief that reality must convince you. But reality only mirrors you. When you are no longer questioning, the mirror has nothing to exaggerate. When certainty replaces anticipation, there is no need for confirmation to shout. The field responds proportionally. Quiet inner states produce quiet confirmations. This is why people often overlook their most important shifts. They wait for disruption. They wait for emotion. They wait for something to feel overwhelming enough to be undeniable. But alignment does not overwhelm. It settles. It feels ordinary because it is natural. It feels subtle because it is stable. The absence of heightened sensation is not a failure of the process. It is the success of it. When nothing inside you is trying to move anymore, you have arrived at the state that movement was always pointing toward. Calm is not the pause between changes. Calm is the signature of coherence. Notice how little effort it takes to remain here. Notice how forcing a reaction feels unnecessary. Notice how silence feels full rather than empty. These are not accidents. They are feedback. The field is responding to internal consistency. If this recognition is landing without excitement, that is exactly how it should land. Recognition does not spike. It settles. It does not stimulate. It clarifies. And clarity does not need volume. Like the video now as a confirmation that this recognition has landed. Recognition is not something you do. It is something that happens when effort stops interfering. Reality does not reorganize itself because you push, repeat, visualize, or desire hard enough. Those actions belong to the identity that believes it is separate from what it wants. Recognition belongs to consciousness remembering what is already true. This is the mechanism. Not force. Not will. Not persistence. Recognition. Effort assumes distance. It assumes a gap between you and the outcome. And the moment that assumption is active, reality mirrors it back as delay, friction, or instability. Desire, when charged, does the same. It signals lack. It tells the field that the state is not present. The field responds faithfully, maintaining the structure of wanting rather than the structure of having. Recognition does not ask. It notices. When something is recognized as true internally, the system has no instruction left to process. There is nothing to correct, nothing to compensate for. Consciousness is no longer trying to move toward a state. It has identified itself as already being there. That identification collapses the need for effort instantly. This is why stabilization follows recognition automatically. There is no transition period required. The moment recognition occurs, resistance drops. When resistance drops, coherence locks in. The body adjusts. The nervous system recalibrates. Perception reorganizes. Not because you commanded it to, but because there is no longer any contradictory signal. Consciousness is not a creator in the way the mind imagines creation. It is not constructing reality piece by piece. It is selecting by noticing. What is noticed as true becomes structurally supported. What is noticed as absent remains inaccessible. Not as punishment, but as mirror. This is why trying to recognize something does not work. The moment you try, you imply that it is not already recognized. Recognition cannot be chased. It can only be allowed. It arrives when the internal argument ends. Stabilization is the evidence that recognition has already happened. You do not stabilize in anticipation. You stabilize in response. The calm, the neutrality, the lack of urgency you may feel are not preliminary symptoms. They are downstream effects. They are what happens when the system no longer believes it needs to move. Effort feels heavy because it is unnecessary at this stage. Force feels misaligned because it belongs to a previous identity. Desire feels quieter because it has lost its job. Recognition has replaced it. And recognition does not demand action. It reorganizes reality by being internally consistent. You are not making anything happen now. You are witnessing what happens when nothing is being resisted. This is why the shift feels subtle. Subtlety is what remains when exaggeration is no longer required to get your attention. Reality does not need to be convinced. It needs to be reflected. And reflection only changes when the source does. Recognition is that change. Everything else follows. Stabilization is not a secondary event. It is the phase that determines whether a shift becomes lived reality or dissolves back into potential. This is where movement becomes structure. This is where coherence decides whether it will hold. What matters now is not acceleration, but integration. In the field, stabilization is the period where identity, perception, and the nervous system synchronize with a new internal truth. The shift itself happens instantaneously. What follows is the body and awareness catching up to what consciousness has already selected. This is why time can feel stretched or paused. The system is recalibrating, not hesitating. During stabilization, external motion often slows. Circumstances may appear to stall. Decisions feel unnecessary. Plans lose urgency. This is not a blockage. It is consolidation. Just as a structure cannot be built while its foundation is still setting, reality does not rush forward while coherence is being locked in. Identity is adjusting quietly in the background. Old self-references dissolve without ceremony. New ones are not announced. They simply begin to feel normal. You may notice that reactions change before beliefs do. That is because the nervous system stabilizes first. It stops bracing. It stops anticipating impact. It recognizes safety in the new configuration. Perception also shifts during this phase. What once felt charged now feels neutral. What once demanded attention now feels distant. This is not detachment. It is reorganization. The field is prioritizing what matches the new alignment and deprioritizing what does not, without requiring conscious analysis. Stabilization does not ask you to understand it. Understanding comes later, if it comes at all. The field does not require mental agreement to function. It requires internal consistency. As long as you are not introducing contradiction through force or impatience, the process completes itself. This is why doing less is often the most precise response here. Not because effort is wrong in general, but because effort during stabilization reintroduces signals from an outdated identity. The system is already listening to a new instruction. Speaking over it creates noise. Consolidation is subtle. There is no moment where you can point and say, now it is finished. Instead, you notice what is no longer present. The urgency fades. The internal dialogue quiets. The need to define or explain diminishes. These absences are the markers of successful stabilization. The field is not waiting for you to act. It is waiting for you to remain coherent. When coherence is uninterrupted, stabilization completes naturally. And once it completes, movement resumes on its own, without strain, without pushing, without effort. Nothing has gone wrong if things feel still. Stillness is not delay here. It is alignment holding steady long enough to become real. Emotional neutrality is often misread because the mind has been trained to equate feeling with meaning. Strong emotion is assumed to be evidence of movement, progress, or truth. But emotional charge is not alignment. It is contrast doing its job. When contrast completes its instruction, the charge dissolves. What remains is balance. Neutrality is not numbness. Numbness is disconnection. Neutrality is coherence. It is the state where opposing signals cancel out because they are no longer needed. The system is no longer pulling you forward or pushing you away from anything. That absence of pull is not emptiness. It is harmony. When internal contradiction dissolves, emotion quiets naturally. There is no battle to win, no threat to respond to, no desire demanding urgency. The emotional guidance system has already delivered its message and shut itself off. Calm appears not as a lack, but as completion. This is why neutrality often arrives unexpectedly. One day the same thoughts no longer provoke reaction. Situations that once carried weight feel lighter without effort. You may wonder if something is wrong, if you have lost motivation or intensity. But what you are actually noticing is the nervous system standing down. It no longer needs to generate emotion to guide you away from misalignment. Alignment feels calm because it is efficient. Energy is no longer being wasted on internal correction. Nothing is fighting against itself. The field is receiving a clean signal. Reduced emotional charge is not stagnation. It is precision. Trusting this calm is essential during stabilization. The instinct to manufacture emotion, to provoke excitement or urgency, comes from an old identity that associates intensity with progress. But intensity belongs to correction phases, not integration phases. Integration is quiet. It happens when nothing is being resisted. You do not need to amplify feeling to keep the shift alive. Doing so reintroduces imbalance. Calm is not fragile. It does not need reinforcement. It needs allowance. The more you let neutrality be what it is, the more stable the alignment becomes. This does not mean life becomes flat or colorless. It means emotion becomes proportional. When something truly matters, feeling will arise naturally and pass cleanly. It will not linger, spike, or loop. Emotional flow replaces emotional charge. That is a sign of coherence. If you are experiencing this neutrality, do not analyze it away. Do not label it as boredom or loss. It is the system signaling that it no longer needs to shout to be heard. Calm is the feedback. To anchor this timeline consciously, comment with the words, "I am ready," to stabilize this recognition in the field. Forcing next steps during stabilization feels tempting because the mind equates movement with safety. It believes that if something is done, progress is secured. But stabilization is not a phase that responds to motion. It responds to coherence. And coherence cannot be forced without being disturbed. When action is taken prematurely, it is usually driven by an outdated internal signal. The identity that wants to decide, fix, or accelerate is the identity that existed before the shift fully integrated. Acting from that place introduces a conflicting instruction into the field. The system receives mixed signals and responds with friction. This is why forcing feels subtly wrong during this phase. Not dramatically wrong. Just slightly off. Decisions feel heavy. Actions require justification. Momentum feels manufactured rather than natural. These are not signs that something must be pushed harder. They are indicators that restraint is the aligned response. Allowing is often misunderstood as passivity because it does not produce visible effort. But allowing is an active state of trust. It is the precision of not interfering with a process that is already self-organizing. It requires awareness, not withdrawal. It requires presence, not avoidance. Restraint is alignment when the system is recalibrating. Just as a finely tuned instrument cannot be adjusted while it is being played, coherence cannot stabilize while being interrupted by constant input. The field needs a clean signal. Allowing keeps the signal clean. Forcing outcomes also reintroduces time pressure. It pulls attention into future projection and away from present coherence. Stabilization happens only in the now. The moment you attempt to secure results, you step out of the creative point and into anticipation. The system responds by slowing down, not to punish, but to protect coherence. This is why waiting feels different now than it used to. It is not empty waiting. It is attentive stillness. You are not doing nothing. You are not disengaged. You are staying synchronized with what has already shifted internally. That synchronization is the work. Trust here is not blind belief. It is recognition that the field has already received the instruction. Additional input is unnecessary. When you stop adding noise, the response becomes clear. You will know when action is aligned again because it will feel obvious. It will not require motivation or courage. It will not feel like a choice. It will feel like the next natural movement of a stabilized system. Until then, restraint is not delay. It is fidelity to the shift. Nothing is being withheld. Nothing is stuck. Coherence is simply settling into a form that can sustain what has already been chosen. Allowing is how you let that happen without distortion. Identity does not lead a quantum shift. It follows it. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of transformation. The mind assumes that it must redefine itself first in order for reality to change. But identity is a reflection, not a lever. It updates only after consciousness has already moved. When a shift occurs, it happens at a level beneath narrative. It is a selection, not a story. Consciousness aligns with a different state, and only then does identity begin to reorganize around that alignment. This is why attempts to become someone new through effort feel unstable. They are trying to force an update before the system has changed. After a genuine shift, old self-concepts begin to dissolve without ceremony. Labels that once felt solid start to feel inaccurate. Preferences change quietly. Reactions soften or disappear. You may notice that the way you describe yourself no longer fits, but there is no new description ready to replace it yet. This in-between state can feel disorienting if it is misunderstood. The confusion is not a problem. It is recalibration. Identity is catching up to coherence. The mind wants continuity, but the field prioritizes accuracy. During this phase, the old identity loosens before the new one stabilizes. That gap is not emptiness. It is space being cleared. Trying to rush this process by defining yourself prematurely introduces distortion. Any identity claimed too early will be built from outdated reference points. That is why restraint remains important here. Let identity reveal itself rather than constructing it. What is real will feel obvious when it settles. It will not need rehearsal. You may notice that questions about purpose, direction, or role arise briefly and then fade. This is not indecision. It is the absence of misalignment. When identity is no longer trying to compensate for internal conflict, it stops generating narrative. Silence replaces explanation. This is also why comparison loses relevance. Old benchmarks no longer apply. You are not who you were, but you are not yet narrating who you are. The field does not require you to name yourself to function. It only requires coherence. Identity will emerge as a byproduct of that coherence. Allow the confusion to be present without solving it. It is temporary and functional. Just as the nervous system needed time to stabilize, identity needs time to align with the new internal state. This alignment cannot be forced or accelerated. It unfolds as certainty replaces reference. When identity finally settles, it will not feel like a decision. It will feel like recognition. You will not announce it. You will simply act from it. And in that moment, you will realize that the shift was never about becoming someone else. It was about letting the reflection update to match what was already true. When old desires begin to fade, the mind often interprets it as loss. It asks what went wrong, what motivation disappeared, what part of you shut down. But desires do not fall away because something is missing. They fall away because their function has been fulfilled. Desire is born from contrast. When contrast completes its instruction, desire dissolves naturally. Nothing is being taken from you in this phase. Refinement is occurring. What once felt necessary no longer carries charge because it no longer matches who you are. This is not apathy. It is precision. The field is no longer pulling you toward experiences designed to teach through tension. The lesson has already been integrated. Clinging to old desires introduces resistance because it tries to preserve an identity that has already shifted. Rejecting them does the same, just in the opposite direction. Both responses keep attention locked on what is no longer aligned. Neither is required. Allowing is enough. Desires are not meant to be permanent. They are navigational tools. They arise to guide consciousness toward clarity through experience. Once clarity is reached, the tool retires. Holding on to it beyond its usefulness creates confusion, not fulfillment. You may notice that goals you once pursued with intensity now feel neutral. Attachments that once defined your direction no longer demand energy. This can feel unsettling if your sense of self was organized around wanting. But the absence of desire is not emptiness. It is alignment no longer needing instruction. This is why there is no need to replace fading desires immediately. The impulse to search for something new often comes from discomfort with neutrality. But neutrality is not a void. It is a stable platform. New intentions will emerge from this platform organically, without force, and without the emotional charge that characterized earlier phases. Contrast has already refined you. It has clarified what does not fit. That information is now embodied. There is nothing left to pursue in the same way. When the system no longer needs to learn through longing, longing quiets. Letting go here does not require effort. There is nothing to release. What is leaving is doing so on its own because it is no longer being fueled. You do not have to detach, renounce, or justify the change. You only have to stop feeding what no longer resonates. Stabilization depends on this allowance. When old desires are permitted to fade without commentary, coherence strengthens. The field receives a clear signal, identity has updated, and attention has followed. What remains after desire dissolves is not emptiness, but readiness. A clean internal environment where what aligns next can arrive without distortion. This is not the end of wanting. It is the end of wanting what no longer belongs. Chasing ends quietly. There is no announcement when it stops. No moment where you decide you are finished striving. One day the urgency simply isn't there. The comparison loses its grip. The internal push that once drove you forward dissolves, and in its place there is a steady, grounded presence. This is not a loss of ambition. It is proof of arrival. Urgency belongs to misalignment. It is the sensation created when identity feels incomplete and believes it must move towards something to become whole. When coherence stabilizes, that signal shuts off. There is nothing left to chase because nothing feels missing. The system no longer broadcasts lack, so reality stops reflecting it. This is why striving feels unnatural after stabilization. Effort begins to feel performative, as if you are reenacting an old role that no longer fits. Comparison feels hollow because the internal reference point has shifted. You are no longer measuring yourself against external positions, timelines, or outcomes. You are anchored internally, and external metrics lose authority. The end of chasing is often misinterpreted as stagnation by those who are unfamiliar with alignment. But stagnation is heavy. It feels stuck. What replaces chasing feels light, even when nothing is happening. There is a sense of sufficiency. A quiet knowing that movement will occur when it is accurate, not when it is forced. This is where magnetism replaces effort. Magnetism is not something you turn on. It is what remains when resistance is absent. When identity is coherent, the field responds without being pursued. Opportunities align. Conversations surface. Circumstances reorganize. Not because you hunted them down, but because nothing in you is pushing them away or signaling need. Magnetism works because it is honest. It does not ask reality to compensate for insecurity or incompleteness. It simply reflects internal stability. The calmer and more settled you are, the clearer the signal becomes. The field knows exactly what to respond to. You may notice that you no longer feel compelled to prove progress. You are less interested in being seen, validated, or ahead. This is not indifference. It is confidence without display. Arrival does not need witnesses. When chasing ends, timing becomes precise. Action arises naturally, without debate or build-up. There is no sense of sacrifice or risk because the action is an extension of coherence, not a gamble to achieve it. Movement feels clean. This is how you know stabilization has completed its work at this level. The absence of striving is not a pause before the next push. It is the confirmation that the push is no longer required. You are no longer moving toward alignment. You are moving from it. A timeline does not solidify through action. It solidifies through consistency. This is the phase where movement has already occurred and structure is being set. What determines whether a timeline locks in is not what you do next, but what you stop interrupting. Timelines stabilize when coherence is uninterrupted long enough to become self-sustaining. Coherence is the absence of internal contradiction. When identity, emotion, and perception are no longer sending mixed signals, the field receives a clear instruction and begins reinforcing it automatically. Interference is the only thing that destabilizes this process. Non-interference does not mean disengagement from life. It means not injecting doubt, urgency, or control into a system that is already responding. Every time you second-guess, rush, or attempt to steer outcomes, you introduce a competing instruction. The field then has to reconcile those signals, slowing consolidation. This is why restraint becomes the final stabilizing action. Restraint is not inactivity. It is precision. It is the decision to let coherence complete its work without being overridden by habit. Trust is not belief here. Trust is the recognition that the instruction has already been received. Timelines do not require maintenance through effort. They require fidelity. Fidelity to the internal state that selected them. When that state remains consistent, external reality reorganizes around it naturally. When that state is disrupted, reality pauses, waiting for clarity. You may notice that when you stop monitoring progress, things begin to align. When you release the need to confirm direction, direction becomes obvious. This is not coincidence. It is the field responding to a clean signal. Interference often disguises itself as responsibility. The urge to plan, optimize, or secure outcomes can feel practical. But during this phase, those impulses are usually remnants of an old control pattern. They do not accelerate manifestation. They dilute it. Non-interference allows the present moment to remain the creative point. The more you stay with what is internally stable now, the less you scatter attention into future contingencies. Timelines lock in through presence, not projection. This is also why patience arises naturally when coherence is strong. Not forced patience, but the absence of impatience. There is no sense of waiting for something to arrive because, internally, it already has. The external sequence is simply catching up. Trust here is quiet. It does not repeat affirmations. It does not seek reassurance. It simply refrains from undoing what has already been done. When you allow coherence to stand without interference, the timeline stabilizes on its own. Nothing needs to be managed at this stage. The most effective action is accuracy of state. Stay where the shift already placed you. The rest is automatic. Creation does not occur across time. It occurs at a single point, and that point is now. Past and future are references, not locations. They exist only as mental constructs used for orientation. During stabilization, attention naturally withdraws from these constructs because they are no longer needed to guide alignment. Anticipation dissolves first. The mind loses interest in projecting forward because there is no internal urgency driving it. When the system is coherent, it does not scan the future for completion. It already feels complete. Planning becomes optional rather than compulsive. You may notice that imagining outcomes feels flat or unnecessary. This is not a lack of vision. It is presence replacing projection. Memory loosens its grip next. Not because the past is erased, but because it no longer informs identity in the same way. Old stories lose emotional charge. Replaying them feels irrelevant. The system is no longer using the past to define itself, so attention stops feeding it. What remains is awareness unburdened by reference. This narrowing of attention into the present moment is not discipline. It is efficiency. The system recognizes that the present is the only point where coherence can be maintained. The moment attention drifts into anticipation or memory, internal signals scatter. Stabilization pulls awareness back because it depends on accuracy of state. Presence is not passive observation. It is active alignment. When you are present, you are broadcasting a single, undivided signal. That signal is what the field responds to. Timeline coherence is sustained by this consistency. As long as the present moment remains unfractured by wanting or revisiting, the timeline holds. This is why trying to create from imagination feels ineffective during this phase. Visualization implies absence. It assumes the state is elsewhere. Presence does the opposite. It assumes the state is here. The field responds accordingly. Staying present does not mean disengaging from practical life. It means not outsourcing stability to a future condition. Action still happens, but it arises from clarity rather than compensation. Decisions feel simpler. Movement feels clean. There is no internal debate because there is no internal split. You may notice that time feels different now. Moments stretch. Days feel less defined by events. This is not disorientation. It is consciousness no longer measuring itself against change. When you are present, time loses its authority. Timeline coherence depends on this. The more consistently awareness returns to now without effort, the more stable the selected reality becomes. Not because you are holding it in place, but because you are no longer introducing contradictory instructions. Creation is not something you do repeatedly. It is something you allow continuously by remaining where creation actually happens. The present moment is not a tool. It is the location. Stay here, and the timeline sustains itself. External reality is never the first thing to move. It is the last. This sequence is not a delay and it is not a test. It is structural. Reality responds outwardly only after internal coherence has stabilized enough to be sustained without contradiction. Internal alignment happens instantaneously. The moment consciousness recognizes a state as true, the selection is made. But physical reality is dense. It is the slowest layer of the field. It requires consistency over time to reorganize because it reflects patterns, not moments. This is why coherence must come first and remain uninterrupted. Impatience arises when the mind expects simultaneity. It assumes that inner recognition should immediately produce visible confirmation. But the physical layer does not respond to recognition once. It responds to recognition held. The delay is not resistance. It is calibration. The field is adjusting countless variables to match the new instruction without collapse. If external reality responded instantly to every internal shift, nothing would stabilize. Structures would flicker. Identities would fragment. Continuity exists precisely because reality waits for coherence to prove itself stable. The pause protects the integrity of the timeline. This is why forcing confirmation backfires. When you check, measure, or test reality for signs, you reintroduce doubt. Doubt is a new instruction. The field responds by slowing further, not to punish, but to regain clarity. The system cannot reflect two opposing states at once. Physical delay is often misinterpreted as denial. But denial feels heavy. It feels blocked. What you are experiencing now feels neutral. Quiet. Unremarkable. That neutrality is evidence that alignment is already in place internally. The external environment is simply recalibrating to match it. Think of internal coherence as setting the coordinates. External reality then plots the route. That plotting takes time because it involves form, matter, interaction, and sequence. None of that is personal. None of it is evaluative. It is mechanical. When impatience dissolves, the delay loses meaning. You stop waiting because internally, nothing feels unfinished. This is the signal the field is waiting for. The moment you no longer need confirmation, confirmation becomes possible. External movement resumes naturally once calibration completes. It does not arrive as a reward for patience. It arrives because the internal signal has remained clean long enough to be trusted. Reality responds when it no longer needs to double-check the instruction. Nothing has gone wrong because you cannot yet see the reflection. Seeing is not the measure. Coherence is. And coherence is already present. The physical world is simply catching up in the only way it can, sequentially. Allow the delay to be what it is. It is not empty time. It is alignment becoming visible at the only pace that allows it to last. There comes a point where the structure of the journey itself dissolves. Not because it was false, but because it has completed its function. This is where consciousness remembers that it was never traveling through reality. It was choosing it. The sense of being inside a timeline was always a perceptual convenience, not a truth. You are not a participant moving through pre-existing sequences. You are the selecting principle through which sequences appear. Timelines are not tracks you walk along. They are configurations that assemble around resonance. What you experience is not where you are going, but what you are aligned with. This is why effort eventually becomes irrelevant. Effort belongs to the perspective of a self-navigating an external world. Selection belongs to consciousness recognizing itself as the source of orientation. When resonance is clear, there is nothing to navigate. Experience organizes itself accordingly. Most people experience life as reaction because they identify with the point of perception rather than the field of awareness. From that position, reality feels like something happening to them. But when awareness stabilizes, it becomes obvious that experience responds to state, not action. The inner condition determines which version of reality becomes visible. Selecting a timeline does not require visualization or decision. It happens automatically through identity coherence. Whatever feels internally stable is what you are selecting. Not what you want. Not what you think about. What you are being without effort. This is why stabilization has been so important. A fluctuating identity cannot select consistently. A coherent one does so effortlessly. When you are no longer oscillating between wanting and resisting, the field receives a single instruction. That instruction is not spoken. It is embodied. From this perspective, there is no urgency to get anywhere. You are not behind. You are not ahead. You are simply noticing which configuration is responding to you now. And if that configuration has changed, it is because you have already changed. The idea of being inside a timeline collapses here. There is no corridor. No path unfolding step by step. There is only resonance expressing itself as sequence. Consciousness does not move forward. It selects a frame, and continuity fills in around it. This realization removes pressure without removing power. You do not need to control outcomes because you are never producing them directly. You were orienting. And orientation has already shifted. What you are experiencing now is the echo of that shift organizing itself into form. Nothing external needs to be manipulated from this position. The only leverage point was internal, and it has already been activated through recognition and stabilization. What remains is clarity. You are not inside the timeline watching it unfold. You are the condition through which it is chosen. And once this is seen, effort dissolves naturally. There is nothing to manage. There is only alignment continuing to express itself. This is not a new ability. It is a remembrance. And remembering changes everything without requiring anything more. Stability is not something that has to be created. It is what remains when resistance is no longer being generated. Beneath effort, beneath emotional charge, beneath constant adjustment, awareness is naturally still. This stillness is not passive. It is balanced. It is the state consciousness returns to when it is no longer correcting itself. Because most people have lived inside contrast for so long, stability can feel unfamiliar when it first appears. The absence of drama is interpreted as emptiness. Peace is mistaken for boredom. Calm is questioned as if something must be missing. But nothing is missing. What has disappeared is friction. Drama requires opposition. It requires an internal split between what is and what is believed should be. When that split dissolves, there is no fuel left for intensity. The system no longer needs to generate emotional movement to guide itself. It has arrived at coherence. This is why stability does not feel like an achievement. There is no peak moment. No rush. No sense of victory. It feels ordinary because it is natural. Awareness was never meant to be strained, reactive, or constantly adjusting. Those states were adaptive responses, not defaults. The unfamiliarity fades as the nervous system learns that calm does not signal danger. For a long time, heightened emotion may have been associated with aliveness or progress. When that association dissolves, the body initially waits for the other shoe to drop. Nothing drops. Stability remains. No seeking is required to maintain this state because seeking is what disrupted it in the first place. Seeking implies that something essential is elsewhere. Stability knows nothing is missing. It does not hold itself in place through effort. It persists because there is no internal contradiction pushing it out of balance. You do not need to protect peace. Protecting implies threat. Peace sustains itself when it is not questioned. The more you let stability be unremarkable, the more permanent it becomes. The field responds to what is treated as normal. This does not mean life becomes inactive or flat. Movement still happens. Decisions are made. Experiences unfold. But they do so without the emotional spikes and crashes that once defined change. Action becomes proportional. Response becomes measured. Nothing needs to be exaggerated to feel real. Stability is not the end of experience. It is the end of unnecessary struggle within experience. From this state, contrast may still appear, but it passes cleanly. It does not hook identity or generate prolonged disturbance. Awareness returns to balance quickly because balance is now familiar. If you notice yourself waiting for something to disrupt this calm, that reflex will fade. It belongs to an old pattern that equated peace with vulnerability. Stability is not fragile. It is resilient precisely because it does not depend on conditions. This is not something you have to hold on to. It is something you stop stepping away from. When resistance dissolves, awareness naturally rests. And resting is not inactivity. It is alignment without effort. Stability is not a phase you move through. It is the baseline you return to when nothing is being forced. There is a point where movement stops not because something failed, but because nothing is left to correct. This is where the shift completes itself. Not with evidence, not with explanation, not with an outcome that demands recognition. Completion arrives as the absence of urgency. As the disappearance of the need to prove that anything has changed. When stabilization finishes, the impulse to validate dissolves. You no longer feel compelled to explain yourself, to justify your calm, or to make your inner knowing legible to anyone else. The desire for confirmation fades because confirmation is no longer needed internally. What remains is quiet certainty. This is how coherence seals itself. Not through display, but through sufficiency. When something is real, it does not require reinforcement. It does not need to be defended or repeated. It simply holds. The mind often expects completion to feel definitive, dramatic, or final in a way that is obvious. But those expectations belong to contrast. They belong to the process of becoming. Completion feels different. It feels unremarkable, ordinary, stable. And because it does not announce itself, it is often overlooked by those who are still searching for a signal. Nothing needs to be proven because there is no longer a reference point that doubts. Explanation disappears because there is no longer a question demanding an answer. Urgency dissolves because there is nowhere else to go. These absences are not losses. They are confirmations. This is also where the last layer of effort releases. Even the effort to remain aligned becomes unnecessary. Alignment sustains itself when nothing contradicts it. The field no longer needs to adjust because the instruction has remained consistent long enough to be trusted. From here, life continues, but it does not feel like a process of correction. It feels like expression. Movement arises naturally, without pressure. Stillness remains when movement is not required. There is no conflict between the two. You may notice that you stop thinking about the shift altogether. Not because it reversed, but because it integrated. What integrates becomes invisible. It becomes the baseline. You do not think about stability when you are stable. You do not think about alignment when you are aligned. This is the final confirmation. Not excitement. Not manifestation. Not a story you can tell. But the simple fact that nothing in you is waiting for something else to happen before you can rest. Let this be enough. There is nothing more to activate. Nothing more to unlock. Nothing more to chase. The quiet you feel is not an in-between state. It is the arrival. If this knowing is clear, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it before their timeline closes.